From the George Ignatieff Theatre at the University of Toronto, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation presents the 1989 Massey Lectures by Ursula Franklin. Her talks are being broadcast each night this week on Ideas and are called The Real World of Technology. Dr. Franklin is an experimental physicist, Professor Emeritus of Metallurgy at the University of Toronto, and the only woman there ever to have held the title University Professor. She's a former board member of the National Research Council and the Science Council of Canada. She's a Fellow of the Royal Society and an Officer of the Order of Canada. In these Massey Lectures, Dr. Franklin is discussing technology not as gadgets, but rather as a whole set of social and cultural arrangements characterized by production-based rules for social control, by pervasive mechanization, by mass production with rigid divisions of labor, and by an associated political mindset, all bundled together into a single social system. Her focus is on what it means to live in this real world of technology. Ursula Franklin.
I must say before I begin this lecture how very deeply touched I've been by the responses of people, and what probably has given me more pleasure than anything else is that I see people talking to each other. I see people sitting with each other who have met here, and I think it's, and you will see it as part of this lecture, one of the really very important things that we now have to do, and that is talk to each other about the things that really matter to us. And if this lecture has given a small impetus to doing this, I would see it with a great deal of thankfulness. So in this last lecture, I would like to do three things. I would like to sum up the flow of my exploration in this real world of technology, and I would like to do that by touching on some of the concepts that I have introduced. I would like to discuss what I think needs to happen now if we want this real world of technology to become a globally livable habitat. And finally, I want to suggest some practical steps that one might take in that direction, steps that are both doable and urgent. But don't expect from me a blueprint to cure the faults of all other blueprints. Because from what I said during these lectures, it will be clear that it is as much the nature of blueprints per se than the details of one or the other that are at stake here. Unfortunately, I will not have time to speak in detail about the work of Ilya Prigogine and his associates, nor will I have time to introduce you to the thinking of C.S. Holling from UBC, and his work on the response to change of living systems and on ecosystems management. But I want to mention these names at least because these are two scholars whose non-blueprint approach I consider as one of the most hopeful and helpful concepts that might allow us to proceed with constructive alterations to the house that technology built and in which we all live. Now let me review first. I began with the concept of technology as practice, which allowed me to link technology to culture, culture being defined as a commonly shared practices and values. And I pointed out that the way of doing something can be holistic, where the doer is in control, but it can also be prescriptive, where the work, whatever it might be, is divided into prescriptive steps, each carried out by separate individuals. And this form of division of labor, which is historically quite early and not dependent on the use of machines, is a crucial social invention which was first practiced at the workplace. And there it became a form of acculturation into a culture of compliance built on the willing adherence to prescription and the acceptance as normal of external control and management. And I felt that an understanding of the nature of prescriptive technologies and of the social consequences of the division of labor is important to appreciate the speed and strength of the spread of technology. I had also at that point introduced a model, a growth model, and a production model. Both underlie the discourse and the decision-making in matters of technology. We had talked about the separation of knowledge from experience that science has brought, and with it came the rise of experts and the declining of people's trust in their own direct experience. We looked at the so-called communications technology and how very drastically they have altered the perceptions of reality in this world of technology. Within a historically very short period of time, these technologies have affected the perceptions of space and time and have led to new pseudo-realities and pseudo-communities. I stressed the concept of reciprocity and pointed out that advanced technologies are frequently designed so as to make reciprocity impossible. Within many of the high technologies, responses can neither be given nor received, and the absence of reciprocity turns many communication technologies into non-communication technologies. I stressed a great deal the role of government in the promotion and support of technology and the fact that it changed drastically after the Industrial Revolution. Since then, publicly financed infrastructures that ranged from rail or electrical distribution networks to financial and tax structures have emerged, which are largely support systems for the advancement of technology. Without the development of these publicly funded infrastructures, technologies such as the automobile, the computer, the telephone, all these technologies could not have taken root. I introduced the distinction between divisible and indivisible benefits and pointed out how ongoing provisions for technological support structures have been paralleled by an abandonment of governments of their traditional mandate for safeguarding the indivisible benefits. Now, with the predominance of prescriptive technologies in today's world, and I think I said that they took over like a giant occupation force, planning had become a major policy tool. It doesn't really matter whether it's government or corporate planning. The difference becomes more and more difficult to ascertain. But what is important to realize is that there are planners and plannees, that there are those who develop the plans and those who have to live within the confines of those plans. And I spoke quite a bit about that. But I also pointed out that there are, in principle, two different planning strategies. There's planning to maximize gain, and there's planning to minimize disaster. And I gave two examples of public planning to minimize disaster. One, the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline Inquiry by Thomas Bircher. The other, the report of the Science Council of Canada on Canada as a conservative society. I did that in order to show that it is quite possible to plan for minimizing disaster. And in this context, I found it necessary to stress that the concept of the environment includes, in fact, two separate components. One referring to the built and constructed environment, which is truly a product of technology. The other is nature. And I made a plea to get away from the egocentric and technocentric mindset that regards nature as an infrastructure to be adjusted and used like all other infrastructures. Finally, I tried to show some common patterns that occur when new technologies are introduced into the society. We looked at cars, the 3 ages of responses to cars, to computers, to industrialized food, to sewing machines. And I pointed out how often the promise of liberation in the first phase of the introduction of a technology is not fulfilled in the subsequent ones, and that there's quite a sophisticated mechanism of building up dependency after having built up acceptance. It would, from all this, be an understatement to say that all is not well in the real world of technology. The social, economic, and human costs of technological advances are evident all around the globe. They are described in newspapers and magazines, discussed on radio, television, and in a vastly increasing stream of books, ranging from the Brundtland Report to recent works by Heather Menzies, I mentioned, and a new book by Murray Bookchin. And that ceaseless exposition of the problems that surround modern technology has gone on for at least 2 decades. While I was preparing this last lecture, I looked again at Fritz Schumacher's talk on technology for a democratic society, a speech he gave at a conference in Switzerland in September 1977, the very day before he suddenly died of a heart attack. Schumacher's talk contains much, if not all, one needs to know in order to proceed to rectify the misuse and inhumanities of technological progress. He stressed context. After all, his notion of the appropriateness of technology is the recognition of the centrality of context. He made a word play out of his name, Schumacher, which means shoemaker, pointing out that a good shoemaker must know all about shoes, about the material for shoes, but most of all, good shoemakers must know about feet, because in the end, the shoe has to fit the foot. Most of all, Fritz Schumacher was concerned at that point about technology as a force that formed society and today forms it in a manner that allows fewer and fewer people to be real people. From all this, it seems therefore fair to say that the convincing and urgent case for not proceeding with global technological expansion along the established patterns was made at least 15 years ago and continues to be made with stronger and stronger arguments. Nevertheless, there has been no change in direction over the last 15 years, but rather an acceleration of the very developments along the lines leading to greater and more irreversible problems. So we have to ask, why does nothing substantial happen? Or to turn the question around, what will it take that something changes? And at this point, I would like to suggest to you that the crisis of technology is actually a crisis of governance. I say governance rather than government because I think the crisis is much deeper than the policies of any particular government. The real crisis, I think, one can best address when one asks oneself, what is the task of government in this real world of technology? What do we elect and pay governments for? What do we expect them to do rather than to say? And it would seem foolish to assume that in a world in which technology has changed all practices and relationships, the practice of government and the relationship between the governed and those who govern would remain unaffected. Kids in school are taught that democracy means government by the people, for the people. But the major decisions that affect our lives here and now in Canada are not made in the House of Commons. And I hold that, in fact, we have lost the institution of government. And we have now nothing but a bunch of managers who run the country to make it safe for technology. What is needed then is to change or reform the institution of government in terms of responsibility and accountability to people as people. Now, you can say, how can one do that? It cannot, I want to say first, be done by some great leader or guru coming out of the woodwork somewhere. And I'm most anxious that nothing of what I say should be interpreted as an opening for fascism. What needs to be done cannot be done as a dictate from on high, but it must come as an inescapable consequence of a movement from below. I've long subscribed to what I call Franklin's earthworm theory of social change. Social change will not come like an avalanche down the mountain. If it comes, it will come through seeds grown in a well-prepared soil. And we, like the earthworms, must prepare this soil and also can put the seeds of our knowledge and concern into this prepared soil. But we have to do it without a guarantee that anything will come up. We know, however, that nothing will come up without the prepared soil and without the seed. And there has, I would suggest, over the last 2 or 3 decades, been an awful lot of earthworming, and some of the senior earthworms are here in this room. We all got rather old and white-haired in the process of it, but it is effective. And so I would suggest that we are already in a period in which this movement from below is becoming more and more articulate, and I would think your presence here is one sign of it, but it needs an awful lot more earthwarming. Now, how do we do that? First of all, it is necessary to transcend the barriers that technology puts up against reciprocity and human contact. Technology makes it very difficult for people to talk to other people because they work so rarely together on regular, non-technologically interrupted scheme. But we have to make the time, we have to make the occasion, be it on the bus, be it anywhere. We have to talk to each other, and we have to talk not about the weather, but about our common future. And how do we speak to each other? There's much to be learned, I think, at this point from the women's movement, from the way women got together to talk about their status, about the oppression of women, historically, politically, and contemporary. Let us then begin with a principled stand, just as women did, not to say it's deplorable, but it's wrong. I feel very strongly that the discourse needs to be begun with a principled sense and with a fresh sense of justice. This all can be done through very simple examples and actions. Look, for instance, at North American newspapers. Look at the Toronto Star. To me, it is a question of justice to ask who gives anyone the right to cut down trees and destroy habitat for the sake of a double-page advertisement for cars. European papers are small. Europeans sell cars. There's nothing essential in the magnification of the obvious. But who gives the right, for instance, to take another example, to people to suddenly wrap their newspapers and journals in plastic that are just adding to the already unmanageable waste? Who gives the right to owners and occupants of large buildings to keep on wasting electricity by leaving the lights on all night in their buildings? These are not questions of economics. These are questions of justice, and we have to address them as such. You see, if somebody robs a store, it's a crime, and the state is all set and ready to nab the criminal. But if somebody steals from the commons and from the future, it's entrepreneurial activities, and the state cheers rather than arrests. We badly need an expanded concept of justice and fairness that takes technology into account when allowing governments to deal with corporations or with people or with the interaction of technical activities and nature. Thomas Berger appointed at the inquiry an intervener for the natural environment, but this is very rare. You may say that political changes that would be required to provide such very different concepts of justice and fairness in decision-making are impossible to achieve. That the technological systems are so profoundly anchored in the political and social environment that they can't be altered so drastically, and this I will not accept. We have seen in the past profound changes. Slavery was abolished, as was child labor. The status of women has changed quite drastically because a time was reached when the general sense of justice and fairness began to be affronted by the owning of people, by other people, by the exploitation of women, of children, of minorities. If we find the current practices in the real world of technology objectionable, we need to cast our objections into terms of principle, of justice, of fairness, of equality, rather than consider these practices inappropriate, polluting, etc. I think we are not dealing with instrumentalities, we are dealing with principles. And we will not change them until we have addressed them as principles. Once the practices are questioned on a principle basis and are rejected on that level, practical ways of doing what is needed will emerge. Technology will change as values change. And don't think that this is a private Franklin pipe dream, because that really works, and it has worked throughout history. Much of my professional work, after all, is to look at artifacts, at old technologies, and say, what does that tell me about the society, their structure, their values? And I want to give you a couple of examples from that. They come from ancient Peru, 9th century AD, 8th century AD. A colleague of mine at the University of Philadelphia excavated a furnace site, a place where a great deal of these beautiful copper objects were made. And he came with a slag and little pieces of furnaces, and we looked at it under the microscope, and I have seen my share of copper slags, and I looked at that stuff, and I said, I had never, ever seen something like that. And we looked at it, and we looked at it. And then eventually, I thought about the people, and it became quite clear that it's a very carefully thought out technology appropriate to the situation in which the Shimo culture needed and wanted to produce quite large amount of coppers, but they were living in a society which was a distributive culture where everybody worked, and the taxation was essentially a labor tax. People, ordinary people, would give a given amount of time in terms of 3 months or so to common projects. And these were unskilled people. And what the slags revealed is that the technology of smelting copper was carried out to the point where the slag and the copper and some of the leftover charcoal were retained in something that wasn't much larger than a soup bowl. Very many of these. But the unskilled labor could charge it, could heat it, and then when these soup bowls of the dog's breakfast were cold, they could be broken up. The copper, which is of course much heavier than the slag and the charcoal, could, through separation in water, be separated out, and unskilled labor, old people, children, could all work to have a very effective recovery. Now, it would not occur to us, but if you are in a culture in which the major source of labor is indeed labor tax, unskilled, and you wish to do very highly skilled things, you look at what needs to be done in terms of a technology to which all contribute, because a redistributive society, as we know it from the Incas, mean that all contribute and all get, but taking into account that experts are rare and far between. So you have a technology from which we can look at both values and social structures. There are walls at the same time that are built with very expert masonry, then a real stretch of stuff that is rubble piled in, just enough to hold and hold well until there's another piece of expert masonry. So it is quite possible, and there are umpteen historical examples, not only do values fashion technology, but it is also possible to adapt technology to what a society wishes to do. And I see no reason why our technologies could not be a great deal more participatory, less expert-driven than they are. But what it means is a principled decision. Why do we do all this? Do people matter, or are people in the way? And the technology will come once we make the decision whether indeed people matter or whether they are just in the way, and you design more and more stuff and more things to make people unnecessary, unneeded, and redundant. Now, I don't think that any one of us wants to live in a society where the driving principle is we will say to people, they don't matter. I want to get to the practicalities by a quick illustration of the sort of thinking that one needs to do on account of my own experience, a position that I have taken with a regard to nuclear waste. I have, throughout my professional life, declined to work on research projects related to nuclear energy, because I find this an unforgiving and unforgivable technology. And my colleagues, who know that, of course, have often suggested that I should put my knowledge into the problems of disposal of nuclear waste. And my answer has been the following. The very moment that Canada decides, as a matter of principle, to discontinue the building of nuclear reactors and phase out the existing ones, as Sweden has done, I will work as well as I can on the problem of disposing of nuclear wastes. However, prior to that principled decision, effective disposal of nuclear waste becomes nothing more than an invitation to create more nuclear waste. And I don't want any part of it. And so one needs to look at one's own conduct and one's own position, but one also has to talk. And I can't emphasize enough that we need a great deal of principled discourse. That discourse is political, in the sense in which feminists say the personal is political. The discourse should be authentic in the sense of giving priority to experience and to genuine and verifiable information rather than to hearsay. It should seek out those with direct experience, those on whom technology impacts. One needs also to pay particular attention to the language of this discourse. And a lot of clarification can occur simply by attending to the language. Whenever somebody talks to you about benefits or costs of a particular development, don't ask what benefits. Ask whose benefits, whose costs. To come back to the discourse that we have to have with each other, on the basis of these discussions, we could make up a checklist, like all the lists that women do and stuff in their pockets. Let's make a civic list. And when one looks at projects that are under discussion, let's say the development on the Toronto waterfront, or many, many other things, at any project, at any loan given, Peter Pocklington is a fine example, one can ask whether it promotes justice, number one, whether it restores reciprocity, whether it, whatever it is, confers divisible or indivisible benefits, whether it favors people over machines, whether this strategy of implementation maximizes gain or minimizes disaster, whether conservation is favored over waste, or whether the irreversible stands back because the reversible is favored. Most things that are done don't work out the way they ought to. It is absolutely essential to favor things which come in small and reversible steps that it is in fact possible to learn. So there's a list of 7 things, not necessarily in order of priorities, that one can use as a checklist in that discourse that we have with each other, and I'm sure you can add to that, expand the list, and it is in fact quite a nice project for a group to say, well, let's make a checklist of that vis-a-vis the waterfront, vis-a-vis the planning, vis-a-vis a response to something like that new goods and services tax. But there are also situations in which, in fact, it is not that clear that one knows what to do. And there are, in fact, what Henry Regier very rightly calls domains of ignorance. And I'm very gratified to know that Henry is in the audience, because I've learned a great deal from him, and I had mentioned in one of the earlier lectures his approach to the Great Lakes, applying the Selye principle of stress and trying to remove factors that can be removed to reduce stress, and how creative I thought this is. In terms of those domains of ignorance, Henry drew attention to the fact that whenever we do something, there are areas that open up new. It's not a question of not having known it or I told you so, but things occur that have never occurred before. And because of that, domains of ignorance open up when things begin to happen. Personally, I think that we will very soon be faced with a huge new domain of ignorance, not even new, but publicly undiscussed domain of ignorance that relates to the effects of non-ionizing electromagnetic radiation on living organisms. and you saw a forum notice for a discussion on it right outside on next Wednesday. But this domain of ignorance need not be as big and as deep as it is had there been a long-term project of adequate research, and had there been recognition of the direct experience of those who work, for instance, day in, day out in front of video displays, or live below high-voltage transmission lines. The experience of those which may not be as clear and as decisive as one might want in a research project, but the initial direct experience of these people has been so marginalized and so discarded that we will now be faced with an awful scramble. And it is just to me one more case of keeping people away from challenging technology. The answer then is to relocate people. If their cows die, in the end, somebody will buy them out. That doesn't solve anything. But it is that approach of marginalizing that points to that disenfranchisement of people as one of the major obstacles to the formation and implementation of public policies that would safeguard the integrity of both people and nature. And this disenfranchisement came in fairly slowly around the time of the Industrial Revolution. And then it became more and more rapid as governments turned their attention to the blind support of technology and its growth at the expense of all other obligations normally associated with democratic governance. Now, I want to say again how much easier it is to design technology with the concerns up front than coming at it at the end. If you think you would have to design a building and be mindful of people in wheelchairs, then that can be done. It may be difficult, it may be a bit more cumbersome, but obviously it can be done. Once you have the building and you say, your assessor said, what have you done about the disabled? And he said, oh God, I must do something about the disabled. It becomes a horrible production. It's very costly, and usually then, for reasons of cost, it's not done. The concern, the value is first. And in the redress that I see is absolutely essential, the reintroduction of people into technology and technological decision-making is absolutely essential. And the action is required on a number of levels, including the refusing of consent to governments to proceed with technologies such as nuclear energy, mega projects, work in space. I'd like to say something to the argument that has been advanced by people I very much respect, to say we now must do research into high technology robotics, because Canada needs to earn the money that will pay for the social services. That argument reminds me of an issue in Toronto Life that comes out around Christmas time. And one year there were the people that the community honored, and there were essentially two groups. The first 50 were the captains of industry who had done all these magnificent things. The second 50 were the June Callwoods, the Rosalie Bertels, the people like myself, who spend their life mopping up after all the heroic deeds of the first 50. And I would suggest that the proposal of saying we drive more automation, more robots, more high speed, high cost, so that we can export with the best of them, so that we have money to pay the mental health, the unemployment, the consequences of alcoholism and violence in our community, that comes because people know they don't matter. I think it's as useful to me as the issue of Toronto Life, and I think we better look what is the price. When we worked on the Conservative Society report, we put down a list of industrial projects that Canada might do, very much focusing on pollution monitoring techniques, on building installations to recycle and destroy toxic waste. There isn't a piece of Canadian equipment that could today do any of these tasks. We import in the city of Toronto waste management equipment and technology that's designed in Sweden, that's designed in West Germany, by people who said these are human needs that require the greatest possible intelligence and compassion. There's no reason why Canadian engineers could not have done that. Just as I feel very passionately that we have to stop the operation and the sale and the building of nuclear reactors, and that we have to take the skills that are in Canada in the research and working community and build teams to safely dismantle reactors, because they will go around the world. There's no way in which this will not happen. And reactors have to be dismantled, and that's a lousy job. And it's a job that requires a great deal of knowledge and skill. And in many cases, it is a job that the population is very reluctant to entrust to their own bureaucrats. So there's something to be said for such teams. But we need now redemptive technologies. We need technologies such as those that Amory Lovins discuss, technologies that reduce the demand for electricity. We need technologies that are redemptive for people, that bring people in the workplace and not push them out. We need redemptive technologies that are concerned with nature. We need also totally different technologies in accounting. We need technologies essentially on 3 levels. We need an accounting system that allows us to keep 3 books. We need the dollars and cent book for the bankers, and that needs to include a column for money saved. We need a people book, a book in which we catalog, measure, and account for what happens to people, for their betterment, or for the deterioration of their lives. And we need a 3rd book, that's an ecology book, that we can account of what a project might do to nature. And only if we can optimize those 3 books with their proper weight can we know how to proceed. But the redemptive technologies that we need are not more of the same, but they are those things that incorporate in them a real demand for justice. I would think that this essentially means a different sort of social contract, one that's appropriate to the real world of technology, in which the consent to be governed depends on the stewardship by the government for nature and people. And I think that nothing short of this will do, and we might just as well be prepared for a very heavy involvement and investment in the political field. And I can only repeat that I see, and you may well challenge this, the crisis of technology that comes out in things like the Brundtland Report, essentially as a crisis in governance. We have forms and people that deal with technology in terms of the infrastructure, believing that the main purpose of government is to advance technology. And it is absolutely essential to challenge this, to say, no, there are people. What are governments for? We'd better talk to each other. We pay an awful lot for those guys. Now, are they really just branch managers to make the world safe for technology? Or have they, in turn, any obligation vis-à-vis us? How can we, as individuals, consent to things that are essentially neither just nor fair, nor are they things that lead us into any livable future? And so I want to conclude by adapting a phrase that E.P. Thompson and our friends in the British peace movement used a few years ago when they had to protest the cruise missiles and Pershings and said, protest and survive. And I think I would like to augment that a little bit to say, let us understand, and on the basis of that understanding, protest, with the aim to change, because only then we can survive. And it is that sequence of understanding together, of protest, of change, that in my mind is the only guarantee that the house that technology built will not end up being a techno-dump. Thank you.
Tonight on Ideas, you've heard the concluding talk in the 1989 series of Massey Lectures by Dr. Ursula Franklin.